Dutch East Indies at Rabaul on New Ireland, Ambon, and in the Solomon Islands. The attack at Pearl Harbor, however, had not accomplished all Yamamoto had hoped for, the destruction of the major elements of the United States fleet. The aircraft carriers which had been at sea were unharmed and represented a constant threat. What was needed was a spectacular achievement, and Yamamoto did not expect the fall of Singapore for 5 or 6 months. It came on February 15. He believed that if he was to achieve his goal of setting up the stage for negotiation, he must move in another direction. But the question before his planners was where to strike next. The army vetoed Yamamoto's suggestion for an attack on the Soviet Union. Such a war would be fought almost entirely on land, and the army was heavily occupied in China and Southeast Asia. So, 3 other ideas were offered. Yamamoto's favorite was to attack in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet and destroy it as Yamamoto had destroyed the American ships at Pearl Harbor, and then push into the Middle East to link up with the Germans who were driving toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Thus, the Japanese Navy would be assured of all the oil it needed. The army refused to consider a Middle Eastern operation, so only 2 plans were left. One, advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for an attack on Australia to deprive the Americans of that forward base of operations. After moving into the Solomon Islands, the Navy would take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Advocates of this plan at Imperial General Headquarters were already setting up occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand. But Yamamoto did not like the Australia plan because he thought it would take too long and still would not be spectacular enough to halt the Americans. Yamamoto also knew the Pearl Harbor attack had aroused the spirit of vengeance in people the Japanese had been learning to detest as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the army said, to fight a war to the finish. It was apparent that even the capture of Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto wanted a victory that would make it possible for Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January, Yamamoto ordered another plan drawn, and 2 months later, sent officers to Tokyo with the document designated the MI Plan, which envisaged a battle off Midway Island where the American carrier force would be destroyed. He also sent to Tokyo the AL Plan, which detailed the invasion of the North American continent via Alaska. If all went well, Hawaii would be occupied, and later, perhaps the West Coast. At least, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give the politicians a base for negotiating the sort of peace that Yamamoto hoped to achieve. In Tokyo, the admirals quarreled around the conference table in the Navy Ministry, but in the end, Yamamoto had his way. Forgotten was the potential significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purpose. The reason they were no longer important lay in the April raid of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doolittle raid had shocked the Japanese into a realization that the Americans were only beginning to fight. In June, after the Midway operation flamed into disaster for Japan, there was no time for recrimination. Indeed, the army did not even know the full extent of the defeat. The news of the destruction of 4 big fleet carriers was carefully suppressed so that it was known only at the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto had been off on his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward to set up the forthcoming attempt to cut off Australia. Naval forces had taken Rabaul on January 23, and from that time onward, they had conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It was apparent to the Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in March, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. If they were successful, it would be very nearly a walkover for the Japanese to take northern Australia. In February, the Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and in March, when they invaded Salamaua, New Guinea, the pace stepped up. In May, just before the Midway battle, the Japanese sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back by the fierce defense of the Americans and Australians in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and built a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Australia that they had to prepare for a Japanese move in the south. MacArthur told the Australian government it must be ready for an attack before a Japanese thrust that was generally expected to be made against India. He cabled General Marshall for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. But in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until the end of June, he would have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific, while on the eve of Midway, the Japanese had 10. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already given advanced warning about the big move he expected the Japanese to make, which turned out to be the Midway battle. While events were taking their course at Midway, the Japanese were establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, and the naval troops occupied Lae and began to build up an air base there. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake was ordered to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be ready to resume the advance against Port Moresby by July. That would be after the Midway battle, when Admiral Yamamoto could be expected to have returned with his combined fleet. That big carrier force was expected to protect this new move. In spite of the defeat at Midway, which was reported as a victory to the forces in the field, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans. A few days after Midway, the Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were ready to move. In view of the Midway victory, MacArthur suggested that the Allies make a preemptive attack on the New Britain, New Ireland area, and then an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the area. With the 2 carriers and the 1,000 planes and an amphibious division, MacArthur would force the Japanese back to Truk. On June 12, General Marshall offered the MacArthur plan to Admiral King with some modification. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, and 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to make the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea because it would put MacArthur in command of the fighting. King's other reasons were supplementary. The carriers would be subject to land-based attack, and they would not have enough protection. As it turned out, the Navy had to cope with both of these tactical problems at Guadalcanal. King devised his own plan, a drive from the New Hebrides by forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to having his army forces serve under the Navy, but nobody could deny the necessity of stopping the Japanese before they took New Guinea and were poised to attack Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who was going to command the operation. They gave Phase 1 the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was just a spot on the map, with no known tactical or strategic value. It did not even merit a name in this JCS plan. General MacArthur was thrown an ESOP, a consolation prize. After Phase 1, he was to take over and mop up the Japanese in the rest of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King was given his way because the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that King had already planned a defense line down the Pacific to protect Australia, and his plan would need relatively less force than MacArthur's. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had wheedled General Arnold into sending several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. He had reinforced Samoa and Afate in the New Hebrides, and he planned to put a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness at the time of the Wake Island crisis had aroused King's annoyance, was shipped off to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were told to develop new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the first effort must be to hold the line in the South Pacific while training the amphibious forces. The second stage would be a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth stage would take the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was just what he himself envisioned, and he made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and told him to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious operation. All this was done even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1. He would take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19, but first he had to go to Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley got to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already beginning in the South Pacific. On May 22, an Army plane saw a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that the grass on the island's central plain had been burned off and tents had gone up in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that construction of an airfield was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew the names, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were the equivalent of American CB units. This information was confirmed in a radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had broken parts of the Japanese naval code, picked up a message saying that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4, and Fleet Intelligence put two and two together. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day, on his way to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific, when Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report. Admiral Turner knew where he was going. It could be no place but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His task was to train a whole amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began to move ships and men around, Admiral Gormley was on his way to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head full of gloomy thoughts about the foolishness of trying to stage an amphibious operation when no one knew how to do it. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, agreed with him entirely. They also agreed that with the planes at hand, they could not guarantee the landing sufficient air coverage. After all, this meeting occurred on July 18, and the landings were to be made in 3 weeks. They sent a dispatch back to Washington recommending that the operation be deferred, but King was not happy with that message. King had told his new commander that he was handing him a difficult job, and that he would not be able to give him the proper tools until perhaps the fall. The answer was no. The invasion would proceed as planned. Gormley had left Washington convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom increased when he tried and failed to get CBs and other units sent immediately to New Zealand. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was notable for failures of intelligence. All concerned commands knew that an operation was in the offing, particularly after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his operations orders. The major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt that they could strike a deadly blow at the Allied build-up. But on July 10, the Allied Intelligence Service's report reaching King contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later, a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield, and back at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission would leave Rabaul on August 14. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley tried desperately to get more help, to build advanced bases, to bring in more planes. But everywhere he turned, he learned the truth of Admiral King's assertion that he would not be able to provide Gormley with proper tools. The supplies of the invasion forces, for example, were loaded hodgepodge aboard the transports at Oakland. There were plenty of docks, so that the ships could have been unloaded and reloaded with supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Noumea, which had had no such facilities. Admiral King had at least a general idea of the difficulties, but there was not time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they got to Australia. The timetable remained. By late July, the rush was on, and 17,000 Marines were moving by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too busy to hold a conference of his commanders. But on July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was supposed to be in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders met to talk about the invasion. Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandergrift. Once the Marines had taken the island, garrison troops would be brought in. But so hastily was this operation called that no one had made provision for any troops to be held in reserve. There were no more men available in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was not a happy one. Fletcher began by announcing that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff members at the meeting concurred, that the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher was gun-shy. He said that the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who had a better idea of the global military picture than any other man in the cabin that day, chided his superior. There was no point in that sort of argument, he said, and the decision had been made to risk all. It was their job to carry out orders. Fletcher ought to have known all that. After Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher